Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. I'd like to visit with you this morning about what's going on in Syria, but we're not hearing a whole lot of what's going on in Syria. We know that there's peace is about to break out in Korea. Let's hope there is going to be an honest peace, and we'll move in that direction. I see Putin is encouraging Trump on this issue that he should follow through, and that's good politics on his part. But we have to keep our fingers crossed. But so far, progress has been made considering where we were a year ago when they were the most evil of all evil empires and they were going to bomb California.
Yeah.
So there's progress there. But then also in the news, which occupies most of the news, and that's Russiagate. And I think that's a game they're playing. I think the peace game, unfortunately, I'm worried that's a game they're playing. The bipartisan deep state and the neocons are playing with us, and they have Trump sort of doing their bidding. Mm-hmm. But even the obsession with Russiagate could be very bipartisan. It could be a distraction. They're not going to be talking about Syria, and they're not talking about the important things. So they are saying that the deep state is saying now that in Syria, of course, there's a lot going on, and they're trying to avoid that, and they would like us to think about these other things. But what I want to mention, I want to talk about this Amnesty International report that just came out, and it is depressing to me. That's all I can say. So there are some stories in the news that has to do with tragedies beyond almost anybody's control, and personal lives are involved, and they get interviewed incessantly on TV. It just totally depresses me because I feel so helpless. Well, I guess we should at times at least admit the truth and feel pretty helpless about contesting, the deep state and the warmongers bipartisan thing. That's sort of the way I felt today, but it doesn't diminish my desire to still keep trying. Yeah. Because when you read this report, I mean, it is so sad. The war of annihilation, the devastating toll of civilians in Raqqa, Syria, and the quote, the war of annihilation is a quote from Mattis because, last June, before it was to really get started and really conclude this war, and we were getting U.S. coalition forces, which are not exactly the enemy ISIS, but they pretend to be. We're there to stop ISIS. So he said, nope, it's the beginning of the war of annihilation, and fast and furious. It sounds like definitely endorsed by the philosophy that I sense that Donald Trump personally has. So they went from what was it, June to October? Yeah. And they fought. And we did most of the bombing. We didn't put in troops. We were 100% responsible for all the missiles and most of the air bombs. But Britain and France had to join in to either claim credit or give support, or we told them to do it. So we finally won the war. But who won the war? Did we win the war for ourselves? Are we safer now? I mean, this whole thing is foolish. And when we were talking before, I was trying to sort out just who really won this war. But I'm sure that I won't get a whole lot of encouragement from you saying, well, oh, this is good news, Ron. You're misinterpreting it. We still have a problem. After 7 years, where are we? We're still fighting Obama's war. Remember, 2011, Assad has to go. And so far, they haven't been winning too much. And the big question now is, who's this a victory for?
And we're seeing the picture up now of Raqqa. This is after the several-month war of annihilation, and at least Mattis was honest. He delivered what he promised. He completely annihilated the city, completely destroyed, carpet bombed. Some people have talked about Dresden as a kind of model of this. But the Amnesty International report, they spent a lot of time on the ground. They interviewed a lot of people. They looked all around in Raqqa, and they determined that one of the quotes from the report, more artillery shells were launched into Raqqa than anywhere since the end of the Vietnam War. That's pretty serious. They interviewed 4 civilian families who between them lost 90 relatives, including one family lost 39 family members. the Bodron family. I think we have a quote, if we have it, some text up there that talks about some of the aspects. This is from the Amnesty report. There is strong evidence that coalition air and artillery strikes killed and injured thousands of civilians, including in disproportionate or indiscriminate attacks that violated humanitarian law and are potential war crimes. That is some pretty serious conclusions made by Amnesty International.
Yeah. And the way I understand it, at least these reports are showing that when ISIS realized they were losing, we allowed them to leave. That's at least what the reports are out there. If they had left and they were our enemies, why did we have to continue the bombing? And this is what the civilians said. ISIS was out and they left, but then the bombing continued. So they were in a dilemma because there were people sort of trapped in there. And ISIS didn't treat them fairly either. ISIS was rather ruthless with the civilians. So they get ISIS out, instead of being a victory, then the destruction of the city came. So these poor civilians are sitting here. You talk about a tragedy. They think, well, what should we do? Should we run or should we stay? And one article said, if they stayed, they died. If they ran, they died.
Yeah.
And then 1,000 died. But the real question is, why did they do that? Oh, well, this is collateral damage. But think of our technology. If we have a guy on the 4th floor of some hotel and we know the wind, that we can target him with a drone.
Yeah, yeah.
And now they devastate a whole city. Oh, this is collateral damage. We had to destroy the city to save the city. I mean, it reminds me of the type of investigation that My Lai had to have to find out who did what, why. But on these reports, they said, well, the Pentagon complained. They never even came to us and asked us our interpretation of what went on there. Well, who's going to believe the Pentagon? You know, they did nothing, you know, they did no harm. But it looks to me like, well, who could win? Did Assad win this battle? Is this recovered territory for the government of Assad? Is it, do we own it along with the Kurds? That's, you know, a high possibility, but we don't hear much about troops from Russia being involved in this battle. I don't think, nobody's accused the Iranians of doing this. It might be all part of a bigger picture, but right now, it really looks like this is not the same victory, quote, that occurred in Aleppo. Yeah. Aleppo had a better ending.
Yeah, and there's a few things there that really are interesting to talk about. The Kurds, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are now in control of Aleppo, and this is the U.S. ally. These are the 70% Kurds. Kurds have never historically had that area, so it's untenable for them to govern this. They can't continue governing it. The other thing you pointed out is really fascinating, because talk about feeding conspiracy theorists about the U.S. being behind ISIS. The BBC broke this story, if you remember, late last year, that according to a secret deal, the U.S. allowed hundreds of ISIS fighters to escape Raqqa. So we blew up the place, we destroyed it completely, and we didn't even get the bad guys. In fact, we opened the door, laid down a carpet, and let them go. Here's what we allowed them to leave with. Hundreds of ISIS fighters, 3,500 family members, 50 rented trucks, insurance must have been high on those, 13 buses, 100 ISIS vehicles, and get this, 10 trucks loaded with weapons. We just said, okay, take off. And a lot of these guys went to the area and are now protected by the U.S., where the U.S. forces are up by the border with Iraq.
Weapons I'm sure we paid for.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt.
This is the whole thing. But you know, there was one statement in here by a British official. He said that we're more careful. Yes, we did participate and we did do some bombing, but we laid out detailed reports, what our plan was and what we did and what we hit and what the result. And we did not want to kill civilians. We made a real effort because we didn't want the terrorists ever to target us. Yeah. As if they do this, invade another country, bomb and help destroy the city. But oh yeah, we did it carefully. And therefore, you rebel people, don't come to London. We don't want you to come and threaten us with terrorism. And I think, how naive can they be? And how dumb do they think the people are to believe this stuff? So it's just going to add more conflict in all of Europe, I think. think. I look at the successes of the enemy, but sometimes the enemy's successes backfire and they end up hurting, just like the Iraq War. That didn't really help anybody except Iran.
Well, at least it shows that the UK does believe in blowback and they're worried about it.
There you
So
go.
that's one good sign. But you mentioned contrasting with Aleppo, and I think that's important because if you remember, in those months that the Syrian government, with some help from the Russians, liberated eastern Aleppo, that was all you saw on the headlines, dominated. U.S. warning them, don't you dare go in there. And they were fighting the same ISIS and Al-Qaeda that was in Raqqa. Don't you dare, you're killing, it's terrible, it's horrible, how dare you. We were close to really going in. If it wasn't for the Russians being there, you can bet we would have bombed it. But Raqqa now, after its, quote, liberation, is still a complete moonscape. And if you look, I think we have a picture of Aleppo. This is just from the end of May in Aleppo, where they've been busy rebuilding it. Here is a Christian church procession at the end of May, the month of Mary, in Aleppo, as it's being recovered and restored. So it's not to say that it wasn't a horrible fight they had in Aleppo, but contrast the two, and you didn't see anything in the U.S. media about Raqqa. There was no critical. It was just nothing.
This picture makes a good statement for an issue that I bring up frequently, because I talk about economic devastation and foreign policy and all the problems that we face when we go through a dollar crisis. And I argue also that it's difficult to go from an authoritarian state to a completely libertarian state, and there's going to be a lot of problems because you have to pay up the bills. I said, but if we had to give up all our wealth, and then we were able to retain our liberty and let us go back to work where we got to keep what we earned. People had to obey the law. They couldn't hurt and kill and steal from people, and had those rules. We would rebuild rather quickly. And that picture you had up there is a typical example. On the one day, we're destroying a city, and then the city that we finally free up to some degree, and people get their freedom back, they'll come and do it themselves. So that's why I always end with the conclusion that we need is liberty and a lot less authoritarian government, whether it's in economics or whether it's in international finance or whether it's this foreign policy. We need to get out of the way, and of course, if you think about it, who's to blame for this? We alluded to this sort of fits Trumpism and his policy, but also I said that this is originated with the Obama policy, the bipartisan policy. So what should be the answer? Of course, my answer is all the same. What are we doing there? Our freedoms aren't being protected, but we send them out there to protect our Constitution and our liberties. No, we ought to just get out of there. But I don't think they're about ready to come home. It's a problem.
I don't think so, and I think the U.S. issued a warning just a few days ago to Assad, don't you try to recover more of your land that we're occupying illegally. But the other couple of things is the U.S. claims that only 500 civilians were killed in Iraq and Syria in 2017, which is very, very improbable. Air Wars, which meticulously documents airstrikes and casualties, they estimate about 6,000 people, civilians killed by airstrikes. And you talk about Trump and the total annihilation or war of annihilation. According to a UN report, there has been a 67% increase in civilian deaths from airstrikes in the first half of 2017 versus the first half of 2016. So a massive increase in missiles fired under the Trump administration. So at least he was being honest. Again, it was a war of annihilation.
Yeah. And there are people who look at it in a slightly similar way as we look at it. The devastation, the bombing has stopped in Raqqa. Therefore, we were sort of responsible for this, so therefore we have to rebuild them. And some people were complaining, well, we haven't gone in there to help them very much. What are we going to do to rebuild it? And this is where I have a bit of a dilemma. I have great sympathy for them, but I like to still say, come home, let the people be free, protect their liberties, then they do what we just witnessed at Aleppo. They rebuild themselves. But this idea that we have the moral responsibility to rebuild, I mean, you and I didn't do the bombing and the killing. So do we have the moral responsibility to go and patch up the work of Dick Cheney and these other clowns? No, we don't have that moral responsibility. And the other reason why I think it's immoral to put the burden on somebody else, but it doesn't work. If you send over if that money had been sent over and given to the government officials, no matter which government it is, it tends to get into the hands of those people who are disgruntled, part of the government. It gets into bad hands. It perpetuates the war. That's why foreign aid is never effective. And you just mentioned the weapons that were being hauled out. Our weapons hauled out, and we're over there supposedly pursuing a war to kill ISIS. You know, makes no sense.
Makes no sense. And you mentioned earlier about, the Pentagon being upset about this Amnesty report, saying, "Hey, you didn't ask us. You didn't ask us." Well, here's why what you said I think is the right way of not trusting them. Here's Colonel Thomas Veal. He's a U.S. military spokesman for the coalition in Syria. Here's what he said about the report. As far as how do we know how many civilians were killed, I'm just being honest. No one will ever know. The other thing. Now, this is hard to believe. This is what he wants us to believe. We adhere to meticulous targeting and strike process that always aims to minimize harm to non-combatants and civilian infrastructure. Well, we saw the pictures. Come on. I mean, that's why nobody believes them.
But in many ways, some combatants, I mean, you even take the Taliban issue. Everybody's a militant. You can't sympathize with some of the things the Taliban does, but in many ways, in their mind, they're defenders of the homeland.
Yeah.
And everybody is a civilian and everybody is a military person, so it doesn't matter. And I don't know how many bodies are there. I think they have an adding machine. They can go around, and sometimes they dig up graves and things. They can find out how many people have been killed. That means the numbers are so high they don't want you to know, but they want to perpetuate this. But, on the overall foreign policy of all this, I think, I mentioned in the opening statement that there's some distraction. They're not going to be talking about this on the evening news, but they'll continue to talk about Russiagate because that affects Hillary and the Republicans, and they're going to be talking about peace breaking out in Korea. But they're not going to be talking about this because I think the big issue is the Shia Crescent. And I think it has to do with Donald Trump, what he did the first week in office. He goes to Saudi Arabia, he goes to Israel. He fortifies the alliances there. They're talking about building and sending more troops and really supporting outwardly, even though we already do support Saudi war against Yemen.
Yeah.
So we have that, and we have the consistent policy of anti-Iran. And Iran, of course, benefited by some of our things that have gone on. So we're bashing Iran all the time. We're trying to get them to do something, out of the ordinary by, us getting out of the nuke agreement. And then we are persistent here. We are really, even though the degree of emphasis on Assad, we're still following Obama. There was a decision made back in 2011. This is good. This is part of the policy. This is part of us stopping Iran. This is the part of helping Saudi Arabia. And this is the reason that we have to do this. And I think that is a very big issue. Now, you make a point to me, which is correct, and maybe this will be, but they usually screw it up.
Yeah.
And they never have but it's too costly to wait for their failures to come about. What did it cost us to see that the Iraq-Iranian alliance, has been helpful in trying to settle that area? But no, we have to keep pursuing it. I think our policies backfire, and that is the reason why non-intervention should be so attractive. Just get out of there, leave, just march out and help people. If you want to really help them rebuild their country, explain to them why sound economic policies, sound financial policy, monetary policy, and non-interventionism is the best way to go, and encourage people to trade with each other. That is the way you'll get to rebuild that area and solve some of these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would close by kind of re-emphasizing what you said. What would have happened if the U.S. had just not gotten involved in liberating Raqqa? Well, we've seen that the Syrians are very, very capable of liberating their territory from ISIS and al-Qaeda control, and they did call in some allies, as we would have done if we were under siege in the U.S. They called in some allies, Russia and Iran, and said, "We need some help. We're on the ropes." They came in. They got, they liberated Aleppo. They liberated Eastern Ghouta and plenty of other places. I think it probably would have been liberated. It would have been bloody. It would have been awful, but it wouldn't have been a moonscape. It wouldn't have been Dresden. So it just shows how the U.S. getting involved in these places does no good. But, we do want to continue exploring these things. And in fact, if I can talk about our upcoming conference again, one of the things we do have planned at the conference, and I'll have some more details later, is we will have a kind of a panel of military officers who are going to talk about our overextension of the idea that our U.S. military should be involved everywhere in the world, what it does to the military, what it does to us morally and financially. These are some of the topics we're going to discuss in our August conference with a great panel. RonPaulInstitute.org/conference to get more detail and get some tickets. Dr. Paul, our first day of ticket sales, I feel encouraged. People are really showing a lot of interest, and there's a lot of buzz about it.
So I got to keep my date?
You got to be there.
All right. Okay, very good. I want to just conclude by mentioning what our title was and questioning about war crimes and who's guilty. We don't happen to endorse the whole idea that you have an international court of justice and war crimes are defined and you go through this process. But I do believe information is important, and I think Amnesty International brings this out, and I think the questions asked at least go in that direction rather than have an international justification for war, such as NATO and United Nations. So we have to combat that the best we can. If you look toward trying to find justice, I think we have to use those courts, but I'd just as soon be out of them, to tell you the truth. But what we should be doing is looking for justice in this country. But we have a problem there. Well, how much are the people trusting now the Department of Justice? How many people now are questioning the FBI and the CIA? Rightfully so, they're questioning this. So it's pretty hard even to deal with that. But that's where our problems should be tried to be solved here at home, to have a Department of Justice and some way of sorting out the truth and finding out who is guilty. If we are committing war crimes, that's our responsibility as Americans to find out and sort it all out. Just as when they were doing the investigations on torture, the people who told us the truth about the illegal torture went to prison. At the same time, the people who did it never was punished. So we need more justice here and not pretending that we know how to pursue justice around the world. And the other thing, if we want to have a ruling institution here in this country, instead of looking toward the international bodies that take control, we should look at the Constitution and devise our Constitution there. But basically, we have to accept the principles of non-intervention, that we don't have a right to harm people and steal from people and lie to people. This is what we have to accept. No aggression against the individual. And along with that, we have to accept the responsibility of our promises. The contract is very important. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it is a moral people that creates a moral government. So as a burden is on all of us, the burden, of course, that we see with our channel here is to get the truth out the best we can find it and know about it. And I want to thank all of you for tuning into the Liberty Report, and come back soon.